What if the most crucial evidence in a murder case isn't a fingerprint or a weapon, but a story, meticulously crafted and relentlessly told, until the truth itself begins to bend? On a crisp October morning, the city awoke to the news of Eleanor Vance's death. A philanthropist, a beacon of the community, found lifeless in the study of her fortified penthouse. The door was locked from the inside, the windows sealed, and the security system showed no unauthorized entry. It was a perfect, impossible crime, a murder committed in a hermetically sealed room, leaving behind only the chilling silence of a life extinguished. The initial investigation was a masterclass in frustration. The city's best detectives walked through the pristine apartment, a monument to wealth and security, and found nothing. There was no sign of a struggle, no foreign DNA, no murder weapon. The coroner determined the cause of death was a rare, fast-acting poison, administered with terrifying precision. The only thing more perfect than the crime scene was the victim's public image, which left no obvious enemies or motives. Leading the case was Detective Miles Corbin, a man who looked more like a history professor than a homicide cop. He was quiet, observant, and had a reputation for solving cases not with force, but with patience. Corbin believed that every crime, no matter how clean, left a psychological residue, an invisible stain on the perpetrator. And he knew the only place to find that stain was inside a small, soundproofed room with a one-way mirror. Weeks turned into a month, and the case grew colder. The press called it the penthouse phantom, and public pressure mounted. Corbin and his team sifted through Eleanor's life, a complex tapestry of business dealings, charitable foundations, and high society connections. They interviewed hundreds, but every lead was a dead end. The phantom had left no tracks, no whispers, no shadow. The investigation was stalled on the precipice of becoming a permanent cold case. The breakthrough, when it came, was not a smoking gun but a whisper in a financial audit. A subtle anomaly, a series of structured withdrawals from one of Eleanor's charities, led to one man, Julian Croft, her quiet, unassuming financial advisor, and a man she had considered a friend. The motive was thin, the evidence purely circumstantial, but in a case with nothing, it was everything. Julian had an alibi, but Corbin knew alibis could be as constructed as a skyscraper. Julian Croft was brought in for what was officially called a clarification interview. He was calm, articulate, and cooperative. He answered every question with unnerving composure, his story seamless. He expressed shock and sadness at Eleanor's death and provided a detailed, verifiable account of his whereabouts on the night of the murder. To any other detective, he was a dead end. But to Corbin, Julian's perfection was the first crack in the facade. The interrogation began not with an accusation, but with a handshake. The room was deliberately bland. A square table, 3 chairs, and walls the color of beige nothingness. The temperature was set just a few degrees too cool. Corbin started with small talk, asking about Julian's family, his career, building a baseline of normalcy. This was the foundation. Before you can dismantle a man's reality, you must first become a part of it. For hours, the conversation meandered. Corbin was a master of the non-confrontational approach. He portrayed the investigation as a puzzle they had to solve together, positioning himself as an ally, not an adversary. He made Julian feel like a valued consultant, the one person who could help make sense of the tragedy. It was a slow, deliberate dance of empathy, designed to lower Julian's defenses, to make him forget he was a suspect in a locked room. The first strategic shift was subtle. Corbin introduced a minor, verifiable lie into the timeline, something insignificant he knew Julian would correct. When Julian did, Corbin praised his sharp memory, thanking him for his honesty. This small act did 2 things. It established a dynamic where Julian felt rewarded for telling the truth, and it subtly reinforced Corbin's control over the narrative. He was setting the rules of the game, without Julian even realizing he was playing. Then came the first application of pressure. Corbin would present a known fact, and then follow it with a question that implied a hidden, darker truth. You advised her on the charity fund, you had access, you knew her routines. Did she ever mention feeling unsafe? The questions were open-ended, but they began to build a cage of association around Julian, linking his knowledge and access directly to the circumstances of the crime. Corbin employed the tactic of rationalization, a cornerstone of psychological interrogation. He began to speak of Eleanor not as a saint, but as a complex human being. He introduced hypothetical scenarios where her business decisions might have been ruthless, where her public persona might have hidden a private steeliness. He was creating a world where an act against her might not be pure evil, but a reaction, almost understandable. The detective then began to minimize the crime itself. He never used the word murder. Instead, he referred to it as the incident, what happened, or the mistake. This linguistic shift was designed to soften the moral weight of the act, making it easier for a person to confess. A mistake is forgivable. A murder is a life sentence. Corbin was offering a less terrifying version of reality for Julian to step into. Isolation is a silent torturer. Julian had been in the small, windowless room for over 6 hours. He had no watch, no phone, no connection to the outside world. Time itself began to warp. His only human contact was Corbin, the calm, reasonable man who was slowly becoming the sole arbiter of his reality. Every detective knows that the interrogation room is a world unto itself, and in that world, the detective is God. The first major fabrication was introduced. "Julian," Corbin said, his voice laced with false sympathy, "we have a witness. Someone from the building staff saw you leaving late that night. They didn't think anything of it at the time, of course, but now." He let the sentence hang in the air. There was no witness. But in that sterile room, Corbin's word was the only reality available, and the seed of doubt was planted. Julian's composure finally began to fret. His denials became quicker, sharper, tinged with the first notes of panic. Corbin didn't challenge him directly. Instead, he would nod sympathetically, saying, "I understand why you'd say that. Let's go over the timeline again." The repetition was relentless, forcing Julian to recount his story again and again, while Corbin watched for the tiny inconsistencies that inevitably appear when a lie is put under stress. Now came the introduction of a second interrogator, a detective who played the bad cop. He was aggressive, accusatory, and spoke of the evidence as an insurmountable mountain of proof. He painted a grim picture of a swift trial, a merciless jury, and a lifetime behind bars. This was a carefully orchestrated performance, designed to make Julian see Corbin, the good cop, as his only savior, his only hope for a reasonable outcome. After the bad cop left, Corbin would lean in, offering a lifeline. "Look, I don't think you're a monster," he'd say. "I think you were in a tough spot, that she pushed you into a corner, and things got out of hand. A good man can make a terrible mistake, Julian. The important thing is to take responsibility for it." He was offering a narrative of diminished responsibility, a story Julian could tell himself and others. Corbin then unveiled the ultimate psychological tool, the false evidence ploy, presented with unshakable confidence. He slid a file across the table. "Your fingerprints were found on a glass in her study, Julian. Not from the days before, but from that night. The lab reports are conclusive. The file was empty. The lab reports didn't exist." But in Julian's exhausted and isolated mind, the weight of the lie was as heavy as the truth. The human mind abhors a vacuum. Faced with what he believed was irrefutable proof, and offered a morally acceptable narrative for his actions, Julian's defenses began to crumble. His reality, once so solid, was now a confusing labyrinth of lies, half-truths, and leading questions. He was no longer fighting the accusation. He was fighting the terrifying cognitive dissonance of believing his own memory was failing him. Corbin saw the shift in his eyes, the moment of surrender. He pushed forward, not with aggression, but with a final, gentle offer of a path to redemption. He was no longer an interrogator. He was a confessor, offering absolution. Just tell me what happened, son. Tell me how it went wrong. It's the only way to put this behind you. The use of the word son was a masterstroke of feigned paternal care. The final step was the alternative question, a classic closing technique. Corbin leaned in and asked softly, "Did you plan to poison her all along, Julian, or was it just a spur-of-the-moment thing, a moment of panic when she confronted you about the money?" Both options were a confession. There was no room for innocence in the question. It was a binary choice between premeditated murder and a lesser, more sympathetic crime of passion. Julian Croft, the calm, composed financial advisor, finally broke. He slumped in his chair, a man utterly defeated not by evidence, but by exhaustion and psychological manipulation. He whispered, "It wasn't planned. I never meant for it to happen." She just wouldn't listen. The dam had broken. The carefully constructed wall of innocence had been dismantled, brick by psychological brick. The confession flowed out of him, a torrent of details that filled in all the blanks. He explained how he had used a poison derived from a common plant, how he had bypassed the security as a trusted guest, and how he had staged the scene to look like an impossible crime. He repeated the narrative Corbin had offered him. It was a mistake, an argument that had spiraled out of control. With the confession recorded and signed, the case was closed. The press lauded Detective Corbin and the department for their brilliant work in catching the penthouse phantom. Julian Croft was portrayed as a cold, calculating killer hiding behind a mask of normalcy. The city breathed a collective sigh of relief, secure in the knowledge that justice had been served and a monster was off the streets. The trial was a formality. The centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the detailed, videotaped confession. Julian's defense attorney argued that the confession was coerced, the product of psychological duress. But to the jury, seeing a man calmly admit to his crime on tape was irrefutable. Julian Croft was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. In the aftermath, Detective Corbin was promoted. He gave lectures at the police academy, using the Julian Croft case as a textbook example of effective, modern interrogation techniques. He spoke of the art of extracting truth, of the delicate balance between empathy and pressure. He was a hero, the man who could walk into a locked room and emerge with a confession, the mind hunter who always got his man. But the story doesn't end there. Years later, a group of investigative journalists, working on a series about wrongful convictions, began re-examining the penthouse phantom case. They were intrigued by the complete lack of physical evidence connecting Croft to the crime, a fact that had been overshadowed by the power of his confession. They started digging into the methods used to obtain it. They uncovered a pattern in Corbin's solved cases. A startling number of them relied solely on confessions obtained after marathon, unrecorded interrogation sessions. They found experts in forensic psychology who argued that the techniques Corbin used, deception, minimization, and false evidence, were known to produce false confessions, especially when used on individuals in a state of high stress and exhaustion. The journalists found that the witness Corbin had mentioned never existed. They discovered that the toxicology reports from the crime scene were actually inconclusive about the exact time of death, meaning Julian's original alibi might have been solid after all. The pillar of the case, the irrefutable confession, began to look less like a pillar and more like a carefully constructed house of cards. The core question became terrifyingly clear. Did Corbin make Julian Croft confess to a crime he actually committed? Or did Corbin create a narrative so compelling and a situation so stressful that an innocent man confessed to a crime he did not commit, simply to make the interrogation stop? The line between interrogation and psychological manipulation had become irrevocably blurred. Julian Croft, now 2 decades into his life sentence, has always maintained his innocence since the day after his confession. He claims he was so confused, exhausted, and mentally broken that he simply told the detective what he wanted to hear, repeating the story that had been fed to him for hours. He confessed not to what happened, but to the narrative Corbin had built in that beige room. The case of the penthouse phantom is now a cautionary tale. It is studied not as a triumph of investigation, but as a chilling example of the power of suggestion and the fragility of the human mind under pressure. It forces us to confront the uncomfortable reality that a confession, long considered the gold standard of evidence, can sometimes be the most unreliable clue of all. The techniques used on Julian are not illegal. They are variations of methods taught in police academies across the country, designed to break down a suspect's resistance. But they operate in a gray area of ethics, a space where the pursuit of truth can sometimes lead to the creation of a convenient fiction. The goal becomes the confession itself, rather than the objective reality of the crime. The legacy of the case is a haunting question that hangs over our entire justice system. How many people behind bars are there not because of what they did, but because of a story they were told, a story they eventually came to believe themselves inside the crushing pressure of a small, windowless room? It's a question about the very nature of memory, truth, and free will. So, the next time you hear about a shocking confession that closes a high-profile case, remember the story of Julian Croft. Remember the quiet power of a locked room and a patient detective. And ask yourself, are you hearing the truth, or are you simply hearing the end of a very well-told story? The answer may be more mysterious and unsettling than the crime itself.